keeping you company this Ramadan.
So let's talk about Sentio, by the way. Sentio Capital, Sentio's investment for good philosophy is based on a genuine desire to use their investment skills for the benefit of broader society, while also delivering superior returns for clients, regardless of market conditions. Visit Sentio Capital, so that's Sentio-capital.com for more information on their Sharia investment products. Sentio Capital, invest for good. Sentio Capital Management is an authorized financial services provider. Still to come, in the global mosques feature, we'll talk about the Masjid Al Aqsa. I think very topical, very important as we into Ramadan. And again, as always, there's a huge focus on what's happening around that region in Palestine and the ongoings around Israel and what's expected. As always, is attrition, but what's the whole background story to that? That comes up later on. Let's talk about South Africa and the impact of. So let me put it this way. So it's Ramadan. I'm Muslim. I fast. So what? So what does it mean to the rest of the people? I'm Muslim. I finish up work early. So what? I'm Muslim. I go for Tarawih. So what? You get my point. What does Ramadan mean to people who are not Muslim? How does it impact on them in South Africa? In fact, does it impact on them? So let's find out more about that with Dr. Quraysha Sooliman, who's the Deputy Director at the Center for Mediation in Africa, the University of Pretoria. Dr. Sooliman, Quraysha, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thanks, Ashraf, for inviting me.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to get someone who I think has a broad insight of Muslims, but also South African society. So perhaps you can answer that question. So it's Ramadan, and we, whatever, you can debate 3 or 5% of the population. So for the rest of South Africa, so what?
Yeah, it's strange that you asked this question because yesterday I was with a CEO from one of the hospitals in Johannesburg. And the first thing she did when she greeted me, she said, "So have you started fasting?" And I said to her, "No, it's going to be tomorrow." And she says, "Well, I really admire the Muslim population in South Africa, that you stick to your cultural and your religious traditions. And when it's Ramadan, you're not ashamed to say it's Ramadan and you fast. And there's so much that we can learn from this, just from staying away." So I think, yes, it's Ramadan, so what? So basically, the first thing is the same as you Muslims, so what? The whole thing is about to be Muslim, not in the way you speak or preach, etc. So not the speaking is important, not in the way you preach, but by default, the way you carry yourself, your character, etc. So Ramadan is the same. How do we carry Ramadan as Muslims? And how do we share this message with the rest of the world who doesn't know, or the rest of the country who might know or not know what Ramadan is all about? And I think generally the message is coming out. More people are becoming aware. Islamophobia has had a counter effect on what Islam is in certain sectors, but in other areas, I think crises, especially in South Africa, have presented an opportunity for Muslims to be showcased for the first time, and people are eager to learn about Islam and what Muslims offer and what Muslims do. And Ramadan is one such opportunity.
And I suppose and I'm going to speak from a personal point of view, it also requires of us to simply not state the obvious, like, we're fasting and we don't eat, but to go into a bit more detail, because it's not just about fasting. So, for example, I tweeted last night, Quraysha, that in fact, Ramadan is the month in which the Quran was revealed, and Ramadan is the month, in effect, therefore, where prophethood was conferred upon the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now that to a broader South African society, for me, is a far more important message than simply saying I'm fasting.
Oh, absolutely, because you're now beginning to create an interest in them for something beyond what abstinence from food or drink, etc. is, and people are beginning to question, who is this prophet and what is this Quran? Because there's been so much disinformation and misinformation that has been spread about it. But I think linked to that also, what you can do and what Muslims across can do is try and find a very pertinent message about Ramadan that resonates with your context in your country. So, for instance, in my case, I said Ramadan is about social justice. This is what Ramadan reminded me about, and it links for me to a very specific mindset and a basic consciousness that is meant to incorporate both the joy and pain of the Ummah and mankind in general. So taking your message is about the Prophet Muhammad. I would say that the Prophet Muhammad was sent not only as as a messenger to Muslims, but to all of mankind. And so Ramadan also, although Muslims engage in it, it carries within it a message for all of mankind. And so that is how we elaborate further.
Yeah, I think that's an important one. And that brings me on to that next point. So how then can we use Ramadan, because of what it is and what it stands for, to therefore impact on the broader South African society? And I don't mean just in terms of knowledge, which we've discussed, but when you talk about social justice, so how can Ramadan be a vehicle for social justice in our country? And is it doing just that anyway?
Okay, so whether the consciousness is there amongst all of the Muslims, I can't speak on their behalf. But for me, I do believe that every act of Islam, every fundamental act in Islam is meant to create some kind of a consciousness. It's meant to stir something beyond just the physical deprivation. So if one has to look at the Ramadan and link it with the multiple analysis of hunger, and it's relevant. This is relevant when I say social justice, because you need to know your country. You can't live in South Africa and not know your country. You need to know that 6.5 million of South Africa's population is hungry and food insecure, that over 20.6% of South Africans are socially vulnerable, and that more than 18.2 million people in South Africa live in extreme poverty. These are things we need to know. We need to contextualize then our situation, our role, our positionality in terms of these facts. Firstly, of course, when you enter into Ramadan, it's an opportunity to give thanks. Am I part of that 18.2 million or that 11.6 million? Secondly, how do I then, as a conscious Muslim, justify my state of privilege, because I'm privileged in compared to this 18 million or this 11 million. How do I then justify my state of privilege with regards to those who are not in my condition? And how do I then utilize Ramadan and every single day as a citizen of this country going forward in terms of what I'm supposed to do? And Islam is about mankind, about empathy, about generosity, about caring, about, the Prophet said you cannot be a believer if your neighbor is hungry, and if you don't love for your brother what you love for yourself. So all of these things come into mind. And so how do I package then the multiple layers of hunger with Ramadan in terms of the social justice issue? And that is about understanding that there's so much disharmony and discomfort in our society that I simply stand outside and I can physically see it, I can spiritually see it, and I can almost taste, the hunger in our population. And how do I then respond? Am I, going to just look at it and drive past? Am I going to give a small donation as a charity or zakat, only thinking that I've fulfilled my duty? Or is there a greater role for me? And so this whole notion about establishing social justice is firstly, of course, about stepping into spaces where you yourself, an individual, can make a difference. You don't have to wait for somebody else to help another human being. And we start there.
Well, I think you raised something that's really important. Perhaps a good way to end with this question to you. So, it's not like Muslims don't give and they don't support, and I think they do that admirably. So, in large numbers, often very disproportionate to the percentage of population, but perhaps not disproportionate to the relative wealth that they have. I think a point you've already made, right? But here's the important one: that in giving, a lot of the giving is in giving food hampers and relief work, support as and when it happens, right? How much of attention should be paid and shifted towards capacity building, which can still happen in Ramadan? It's not as cute as lining up 1,000 people because it's visually not as strong. But how important is that to invest in capacity building to uplift society, which then moves towards a preventative situation as opposed to a reactive situation?
Very important, and that's exactly how you develop, the consciousness about social justice. Because if you look at it, the people who are socially vulnerable, the people who are suffering from extreme poverty, and the people who are hungry and food insecure are basically the vast majority that have been disproportionately affected by the history of apartheid. And of course, a very, very pitiful state of governance this last 30 years. So what happens then? There's disparities in the distribution of resources and poor educational opportunities. These are two simple things that Muslims can do. We can come together and start focusing on infrastructure development, focusing more on educational opportunities, go into areas where there are, schools are in shambles, where there's difficulty in accessing proper schools, etc., or even for learners to access now, as you see the students protesting in the universities, simply to access higher education. We can get involved in this. You must remember, we cannot sit and wait for government to do things. We have a responsibility, and part of that responsibility is to make sure that we uplift people through definitive capacity building. Also create more job opportunities. Look for ways in which you can facilitate or create spaces where people can empower themselves. But fundamentally, the two most important things is the disparities in the distribution of resources. So try and go into areas where you can help put in place creches, schools, skills where they can learn technical skills, where they can learn craftsmanship, works, etc. There are so much talent in our communities and so much that we can do to facilitate for the talent that is in communities where people don't have access. And more importantly, we need to work really, really hard in terms of the education sector.
Absolutely. Well, I think a lot that's come out of it, and perhaps lots for us to ponder over and act upon. And in terms of that infrastructure development, I think perhaps the example for most people to consider, considering our in inverted commas, the drive to emulate the Sunnah, is perhaps look at the Medina model and what happened between the people of Medina, the Ansarullah, and those that migrated from Makkah. What did they really do? Just think about that, and then you'll know exactly what I'm referring to. Dr. Quraysha Sooliman, appreciate your time. Thank you as always for your insights and invaluable insights at that. Dr. Quraysha Sooliman is the Deputy Director at the Center for Mediation in Africa at the University of Pretoria. Juma Mubarak and Ramadan Mubarak for the rest of this month.
To you too. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much to consider coming out of that particular conversation. By the way, we've got a feature called Champion Spotting, and I want you to assist me with this one. It's part of an ethos that I have at Champion South Africa, where we want to build champions, and part of building champions is spotting champions. So if you know of an activity, an organization, something that's happened where there's an activation that's taken place, we say, how that's champion-like, because that contributes to nation building, then we certainly want to know all about that. We'll be chatting about the Sharpeville Apartheid Police Station and how that's changed dramatically so shortly, in fact. But while we're talking about shortly, don't forget to listen to Inayat. He's not in the morning, so I can be here at 4:45 this afternoon. We'll be chatting to the Washington, D.C. based human rights activist, that's Al-Hajj Mauri Salakan, in reference to the resolution that Ilhan Omar, remember she's the American woman, Somali born, has introduced regarding the condemnation of Islamophobia. So it's suddenly a big issue in the USA, and they will talk about that. Also, Aisha Ayyub will talk about Animals and Awareness tomorrow from 12 to 1. So don't miss that, right? Still to come, money is always important. We'll talk about that and see how you can manage your portfolio with Central Capital in a moment.